So finally we have come to this great finale of Professor Robinson's visit to NTU. And I guess there's no introduction needed. So Professor Robinson is going to continue to talk about this great topic, searching for fish in trees. And then for those of you who have attended the first part of the talk, then you probably know the context. But again, today, let's welcome Professor Robinson.
Maybe I'll just do a little kind of recap of what we talked about last time, since some of you were not here, I think. The faculty asked me to give a couple of lectures about my research, so I'm trying to talk about this survey paper that Nathan Nunn and Jacob Moscona, two of my collaborators, were writing for the Handbook of Economic Growth, the next edition of the Handbook of Economic Growth. And the chapter has the rather mysterious title, Searching for Fish in Trees, which is a kind of metaphor from the Chinese philosopher Mencius about basically doing a pointless exercise, you know. And we're trying to provide a kind of taxonomy for talking about problems of economic development and how to think about problems of economic development. And I guess part of the point of the taxonomy is to sort of suggest that many development economists have kind of come at contemporary problems of development with a sort of perhaps a rather out-of-date model in mind. Okay, so like maybe I'll just plunge straight into this to kind of as a way of doing a recap. So what I was talking about last time is, you know, what I call the classical matrix, which I don't have here, where we distinguish between vertical and horizontal determinants. So think of the problem of development economics is like countries differ in their characteristics. So some countries have secure property rights and other countries have insecure property rights. Okay, so insecure property rights creates underinvestment and poverty for kind of very familiar economic reasons. Okay, and we can rank that in the sense that it's better to have secure property rights than insecure property rights. So that would be an example of a kind of vertical distinction. Okay, so one country is two countries. I can rank these in welfare terms. Secure property rights are better than insecure property rights. The other thing I was discussing is it possible to kind of manipulate these determinants? Okay, so property rights, that seems like you can manipulate it. You can improve the security of property rights. Maybe it's not easy, but you can do that through, you know, maybe facilitating, creating certificates, giving people better defined property rights, by improving the legal system, by hiring the police or improving state capacity that can enforce people's property rights. So that would be an example of something that was manipulable. And I was making the point that most of development economics is essentially about, you know, things that are vertical and manipulable. So the lead example I gave on Wednesday was health interventions. So good health is better than bad health, okay? So that we can rank, and we can do something about bad health through some kind of medical intervention. We can vaccinate people, or the example I was giving was deworming. We can give people medicine to get rid of intestinal parasites. Okay, so that's vertical and manipulable. At least when I was studying development economics when I was an undergraduate in London, all of development economics seemed to be about that. And those are examples of what I was calling classical determinants. You know, the fact that Arthur Lewis back in 1954 in his famous kind of path-breaking article about the problem of development sort of says, you know, the problem of development is you have to move resources from this traditional sector into this modern sector. You know, how do you do that? You accumulate capital, basically. And so the problem in poor countries, they don't save enough. So you just have to increase the rate of saving to accumulate capital, and that generates this structural transition out of the traditional sector into the modern sector. Okay, so classical determinants, I was talking about classical determinants of things like saving and things like health, things like property rights, corruption. Less corruption is better than more corruption. Okay, so there we can, you know, poor countries have more corruption, rich countries have less corruption, according to Transparency International. We can rank that vertically, and at least we can think about, you know, the British government at least thinks it can solve the problem of corruption by creating anti-corruption commissions, you know, and We think it's manipulable. Some of these things, of course, are much easier to manipulate than others. It's much easier for me to give you medicine to get rid of your intestinal worms than it is for me to reduce corruption or improve the security of property rights. Or even increase saving I was talking about. Okay, so that was my kind of the classical matrix. But then what I was giving you was I gave a whole bunch of examples to sort of suggest, well, actually, even that world is a little bit more complicated than you probably thought it was. Meaning, in many cases, you might sort of characterize the problem of development in terms of these kind of classical determinants, and we think of them as manipulable. But the reality is that that is a very kind of parsimonious model of economic development. And those economic determinants are kind of sitting in a society. They're sitting in politics, they're sitting in, and what you see over time, I'm going to show you some real data actually we've done from like scraping journal articles with ChatGPT, is what you see over time, of course, is that people have become more and more conscious of this. And they started trying to, first of all, it's kind of things go wrong because there's all these non-classical factors that are somehow inexorably wrapped up with classical factors. So I gave an example of the tragedy of the commons from southern Africa, from Lesotho. I'm not going to relive that, but just to say, that was a kind of transition to this matrix to sort of say, if you look at the history of development economics in the last 20 years, I think people have become more and more aware that this way of thinking about development in this simplistic way about health and education and even corruption or whatever, well, but there's all these other things going on at the same time. And so this is an attempt to kind of reformulate that with what I'm calling non-classical determinants. Okay, so what's a kind of example of a non-classical vertical determinant? Okay, well, you could say kinship relations. So nowadays, everyone is, at least a lot of the people I talk to are obsessed with kinship relations. So here's what's a hypothesis about kinship relations? That one of the things that led to successful economic development and the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe was the banning of cousin marriages by the Catholic Church. Okay, so cousin marriages breaks up extended kinship groups. And if you look at the world today, the parts of the world that are relatively poor, like in Africa, have very elaborate kinship systems. Okay, that's the sort of, again, I didn't hear anything about kinship. Maybe when I took an anthropology class at the London School of Economics, the anthropologist talked about kinship system, but no economist I ever interacted with talked about kinship systems. So I'm calling this that's a non-classical determinant. Okay, and there's a lot of stuff here, and I don't have time to talk about it, so I'm just going to give you the flavor of it. But this is one where you can impose this vertical ranking on it. Okay, and you can manipulate it. I just said the Catholic Church. Many US states, there's a fantastic paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by a gentleman called Munir Squires with some co-authors whose names I can't remember, about the impact of banning cousin marriage in the 19th century in the United States. Many US states, some US states banned cousin marriage and others didn't, and they look at the economic consequences of that. Okay, so it's vertical, perhaps, and it's manipulable. Okay, now, before I had, in the classical matrix, I had vertical, horizontal, manipulable, not manipulable. Okay, but one thing I was trying to talk about last time a little bit is once you get into this non-classical world, we're really, as economists, we're kind of really outside of our comfort zone. Okay, so for example, another variable that kind of appears quite a lot in development economics nowadays is trust. Okay, you could think about the work of Robert Putnam, the political scientist Robert Putnam, his work on social capital. Why is the north of Italy prosperous and the south of Italy poor? Well, the north of Italy, they have much more social capital and trust. Okay, so trust comes in, sounds like it's vertical. North of Italy, trust, a lot of trust, good. South of Italy, not much trust, bad. If you look at data from the World Value Survey, for example, they ask these questions about, do you think most people can be trusted, for example? And if you look at the relationship, like if you just look at the correlation between people's answers, like what's the proportion of people in a country that say most people can be trusted, that's highly correlated with income per capita. So in Africa, you have extremely low levels of so-called generalized trust, however you want to interpret that question, okay? But I think we can kind of probably agree that we don't really have, how do we improve trust? If we lack trust, it's not like giving someone a deworming pill, okay? So it's much more difficult. You might say, well, in principle, trust is endogenous. I agree with that. But how do we manipulate it? So now we kind of have what we call partly manipulable sort of thing, okay? So that goes in the partly manipulable bin here. I'm going to get into some more details, just like trying to talk about some of these other things here. Nathan, one of my collaborators, Nathan Nunn, likes talking about ontology nowadays. So ontology is a kind of branch of metaphysics, which is about the kind of nature of reality, But it's a very big word for economists. Most, like ontology. It sounds like, Acemoglu says it's like ridiculously pretentious to talk about ontology. But I actually find it it's quite interesting. I'm probably not going to spend too much time talking about it. Anyway, what else do we have on here? Just to sort of talk about some examples that I'm going to talk about in a minute. National identity. So here's an interesting kind of variable. So in the last, 20 years or so, there's been this literature on the economics of identity, which was started by George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton, that people's identity is very important for their economic behavior and probably, for their political behavior. So a lot of people talk about how in successful development experiences, you need people to cooperate. You need a kind of national project, and having a national identity or that's kind of plays an important role in getting people moving in the same direction. That one problem you could say in Africa people have multiple identities. They have local identities, they have ethnic identities, but they probably don't have a kind of national identity, and that's something that makes it difficult to have a national development project. So there's not great empirical research on this, but you can think of connections between identity, national identity, but this is not in the vertical bin in the sense that I'm not saying it would be good, Taiwan's development would go better if you all thought you were British. What matters is not which national identity you have, but that you do have a national identity, okay? So that's an example of what we call the horizontal distinction, meaning I can't rank that. There's no argument that being British is better than being Taiwanese. What's important is you have a national identity, according to this argument. All right. I don't think there's great evidence about the relationship between national identity and economic development, even though it's kind of talked about quite a bit. To my knowledge, there's no good empirical paper. You can think of mechanisms. I don't think it's a ludicrous idea. If you get a good idea how to investigate it empirically, go for it, I'd say. Okay, but here I'm just saying, could it be manipulated? Possibly, There's a very famous study by a sociologist called Peasants into Frenchmen, which is about the creation of French national identity in the 19th century. If you go back to the start of the 19th century, basically being French didn't really exist except maybe in the Paris basin. There were all of these regional identities. There were even separate languages. I have a lot of friends in the south of France who teach at a university in Toulouse, and they speak Occitan, it's Occitan. So for them, that's a different language. Occitan is a different language. A bit close to there, people speak Basque, for example. Basque, they speak Catalan, languages which cross into Spain. And that, so there was lots of different languages. And in the 19th century, through, mostly through the education system, through the imposition of a national curriculum in France, other things too, kind of the spread of markets and stuff, that's also one of the mechanisms, this French national identity appears. So it's not like deworming pills, but at least maybe eventually you could manipulate it. So it's in the partly manipulable bin, like trust. But again, I want to say here, you can't really rank that. Okay, it's like one national identity or another. You can't really rank it. Okay, so and here we have other things like the caste system. So in India, you have this caste system. You have this hierarchy of castes. People are divided into these different castes. which are kind of embedded in this sort of religious identity. That says vertical here in the sense of there's a lot of, not a lot, there's some very nice empirical papers showing that the caste system, leads to extreme misallocation of talent, you could say. And it's non-manipulable in the sense that how do you change these it's very difficult to change these castes. People are born into with this particular caste label, and what caste label you have is supposed to be determined by your behavior in your previous life, so you're incarnated in the Hindu religion, and your present status is a reflection of your past behavior, So that's something which is really difficult to kind of manipulate, okay? So I don't want to go kind of exhaustively through this menu here, but what I want to say about this menu, I want to say kind of like two things about this matrix here, which when we're in this kind of non-classical world of these kind of things that development economists talk about nowadays, like cultural things or behavioral things. I didn't talk much about behavioral things, but I could. Is like, first of all, they start sounding much more complicated to manipulate. They also start getting much more kind of ethically complicated to manipulate. Okay, so meaning I'll get more into that in a minute. But like, even if you could manipulate the caste system, if you really thought the caste system was a reflection of people's religious beliefs, then, are we in the business of altering people's religious beliefs? That seems like a difficult thing to do, at least from a kind of ethical point of view, I would have said. Okay, so that's one thing we want to get out of this is like, actually this world, it starts looking more difficult to manipulate things. It's not like giving you an anti-worming pill. And it looks more complicated normatively manipulating things, okay? And here's the next bit, which I should have told you to close your right eye so you wouldn't see the third column there, is at least, when we started discussing this, is it so obvious how these things are ranked, okay? Meaning, I started off with this example of kinship relations, is it so obvious? There's this literature about how, and I'm going to show you some regressions very shortly. So some evidence, there's a literature on how, dense kinship relations, like extended families, clans, like elaborate notions of kinship or whatever, are bad for economic development. Okay, that was the story I started with.
Is that what you're referring to?
So I'm going to come to a very concrete example, but like, and is it so obvious that that's true? Like, that's my point here. Like, I think like economists are way out of their kind of comfort zone, like theoretically, for example, in talking about things like this, meaning kinship systems might have all sorts of consequences and mechanisms that are not conceptualized at all by economists, but maybe they're important before we start pontificating about what's good and what's not good. Okay, so we throw this this third thing in which we call reverse vertical. So what do I mean? Like, so here's a motivating example of reverse vertical. So reverse vertical. Here's a book from 1979, Japan as number one. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the whole bunch of people. Ronald Dorr was a British kind of industrial relations scholar who wrote about. He has a very famous book called Japanese Factory, British Factory, where he basically claims, with good reason, that Japanese factories were just much more efficient than British factories. And then he wrote a book about basically how Japan had a model which was way better than the Western model. Think about, lifetime employment. Think about, just-in-time production, like the way Japanese production was organized, was much more efficient, and so we were all going to be copying the Japanese model. That's what Vogel wrote in 1979. More kind of outrageously, Ian Morris, who's an archaeologist at Stanford, wrote this book called "Why the West Rules." ... For now, basically about how actually China has much better determinants. So think about, I'm using this language, determinants is sort of like the characteristics of society that influence, their path of economic development and capital accumulation and technological change. His argument is that China actually has much better determinants than Western societies. How come China is much poorer than Western societies? How come the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain and Western Europe and North America and not China? Well, China made a few mistakes in the 18th century. Things got a bit messed up. The Qing made some, wrong turns. There was corruption. They froze the land tax in nominal terms. They undermined the fiscal basis of the state. Then they got caught up in this whole colonialism. There was opium, whatever, okay? There's a mess for 200 years. Now the Chinese have sorted themselves out, and they're going away. They're rocketing away, and they're going to overtake the West. Why? Because they're huge, they have all this scale, and they're really orderly. They have this historic 3,000-year history of state centralization. Everybody kind of works together because of Confucius. They all have this project. What's that image? You rectify yourself, and then you wreck your family, and then it spreads out, like the ripples in a pond, and the state is rightly ordered, So there's a kind of model of collaboration and social order, which according to Ian Morris is much more effective than all these Western people squabbling over nothing. Okay, so that's an example of reverse vertical. Okay, it's a very basically meaning we think China. We're trying to development economists are trying to explain why China is poor because it has worse determinants than Western countries, but actually we're focusing on the wrong thing. That if you could actually focus on the right determinants, you'd see that China was actually better equipped to succeed than Western countries. All right, so that's a really big example of reverse vertical. So I like this example, because when I explained it at this development economics conference at Yale in September, people got so upset with the whole idea that I thought we're really onto something here. If you can get people so upset, it's because they hadn't thought about it before. It never occurred to them that they were wrong and that poor countries might actually end up being more successful than, but if you study history, you see places rise and places decline. And I'm British, we used to have an empire. We used to, everybody used to use pounds, and then they didn't, and then they used dollars. So could it not be that we'll all end up, using Chinese currency? Of course it could. Of course you have to imagine that's possible. So I think it's good to be provocative. Anyway, just to give you some more kind of substance here, one of the points we try to make in the paper is kind of in this transition from classical to non-classical is, you start seeing a lot of unintended consequences, and I think that's because not really understanding what's going on. And one of my favorite ones, I was talking about kind of how manipulable identity is that I gave the example of peasants into Frenchmen, but there's a beautiful study by Vicky Foucault, who's a Greek political scientist at Stanford, looking at a kind of, not an experiment, but looking at a kind of real-world natural experiment during the First World War in an attempt to kind of Germanize in the United States. So in this First World War, when the United States entered the war with Germany, some states in the US decided to ban teaching German in schools. Okay, so of course there are many German migrants in the United States, and so then there was a lot of kind of anti-German sentiment when the war started, so they decided to ban teaching German in schools. So what she noticed was, there was a beautiful kind of natural experiment, which was that Indiana and Ohio introduced anti-German laws, but Michigan and Kentucky didn't. Okay, so you can kind of she looks at the borders, basically. So, of course, you could say, well, Indiana banned anti-German laws because there were lots of Germans in Indiana. And Michigan didn't do it because there were no Germans. Okay, so what she does is, let's say here, look at the boundary between Michigan, I guess this is Indiana and Michigan. So she looks at the boundary, and she looks at the kind of incidence of Germans, and she sort of tries to show, well, actually, if you look at the boundary, on one side of the boundary, they introduce these laws banning German, on the other side, they don't. But actually, they're pretty similar, you know, in terms of their characteristics and in terms of actually how many Germans there were. Okay, even though it might be true in the whole of Michigan, there's fewer Germans than there is in Indiana. If I zoom in on the boundary, it looks kind of similar. You know, Germans tend to live in the same place, it turns out. And, you know, they spill over the boundary. I mean, who really cares about the boundary between Michigan and Indiana anyway? So her study is like, what's the effect of this attempt? So the attempt to ban, you know, now we're in a really kind of non-classical world here, right? You know, I didn't learn, in introductory economics books, you don't talk about trying to change people's identity. But this is a real world thing, okay? They banned teaching German. What's the effect of that on people? Did everyone said, oh gosh, yes, no, I don't want to be German anymore. I want to be American. And, you know, you might be able to tell from the title of the paper, Backlash, that's not what happened, okay? So, you know, so here's the regressions, you know, just to give you, so how would you know? Okay, so what she did is she looks at people like who were treated, so basically people who were of school age at the time this law was imposed. And then she looks at their children. She traces them and she asks the question, imagine you were at school in one of these places where they banned German. What's the likelihood that you gave your son a distinctly German name? So instead of calling them James, you call them Adolf Robinson. Okay. And what she shows is that actually goes up. Okay, so the probability that you give your son a distinctly German name actually goes up if you were treated, meaning, you know, if you were exposed to these laws banning teaching German in school. And you're more likely to marry a spouse with a distinctively German name. Okay, so if you're Brunhilde, you're more likely to marry Adolf, you know, than if you were not treated. So hence the backlash, you know. So I think, like, we don't have a good theory of identity creation and the, you know, I mean, George Akerlof sort of has a theory, but you know, like, there's a lot of work to do. So you know, and of course, no economist did this. This wasn't the economist that did this. This was the U.S. state government that did it. But I think it's a very nice example of like how we don't really understand what leads people to adopt identities or defend identities. And it's kind of unusual. Like in economics, you sort of think, if I make something more costly, you do less of it, you know. But here, in some sense, I made it more difficult or more costly to be German, and you did more of it, you know. So that's a weird thing, you know, as an economist. All right. So this is just to sort of say, you know, like, I mean, this is not reverse vertical. This is just kind of getting into this idea that you know, we don't really have good theory in this non-classical world. And when you don't have good theory, I think like one of the things we notice in these studies is that there's lots of unintended consequences. And I'm going to give you some more examples as we go on, even more like striking. Okay. And then I talked about reverse vertical. Okay. So you might be skeptical about Ian Morris's argument, you know, or you might be thinking like, great, you know, we're going to be running the world soon, which might be true, you know. But let me try to give you some, you know, like, you know, so this is, you could sort of call this as like, this is a sort of global reverse, you know, like this is like you really got the ranking wrong, you know. So, but that, you might think that's a little bit too much, okay. But like what certainly is much more plausible is what you could call local reverse vertical, meaning sometimes these rankings can reverse depending on the context. Okay, so let me give you a very specific example of that, which I like very much from the research of Leander Heldring. Here's an example from the matrix. Let me go back to the matrix I didn't talk about. Well, I had it on here, but my co-authors got rid of it, or they changed it to views of the state. Okay, well, let me say state capacity. Okay, so nowadays economists talk a lot about state capacity. They're kind of, it's not very well conceptualized what that means, but sort of like the ability of the state to get stuff done, the ability of the state to kind of get citizens to obey rules, to collect taxes, to implement policy. So, you know, in the context of the East Asian miracle, you could say, you know, what's distinctive about the Korean growth experience is the ability of the state to like implement policy. So, you know, the state nationalized the banking system. The state said, you know, we'll give you subsidized credit if you export. Okay, so, but that means that if you don't export, you have to have the ability to take away the subsidy, or it has to be credible to take away the subsidy. Okay, and that needs capacity, you could say. It needs this. So that's the idea. So I had state capacity here, but one of my co-authors changed it into some wishy-washy thing about views of the state. I don't even know what that means, but let me talk about state capacity. I'm not sure I know what that means either, but I've said it more frequently, so it kind of, familiarity breeds security. Okay, so state capacity sounds like a great thing, doesn't it? Like state capacity, raise taxes, what's not to like? Okay, so what Heldring has done in like a couple of papers is sort of show, yeah, but it's state capacity that murdered the Jews in the Holocaust in some sense. So he has a paper on the Nazi state. So state capacity can be used for providing public goods and all of that, but it can also be used for murdering people. He in his dissertation at Oxford, he didn't look, I was going to show you something from his dissertation, he didn't look at the German state, he got on to Germany, but he looked at Rwanda. So you probably know in 1994 in Rwanda there was a genocide where about 1 million people were killed in a couple of months. There was a conflict, it's a long story, but there was a conflict between, you could say, two groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, and about 1 million Tutsis were massacred in the space of a couple of months. Okay. Now, what he shows in his paper, it's in the, I don't have the title, I have it here, The Origins of Violence in Rwanda, it's also in the Review of Economic Studies, is that, so what, if you look at the qualitative evidence on this, there's a fantastic report by Human Rights Watch also, which you can download. If you want to know something about the Rwandan genocide, it's called Leave None to Tell the Story. You can download it. It was written by a bunch of anthropologists and historians after the genocide. You can download it from the Human Rights Watch webpage. If you read those anecdotes, you kind of see the genocide is not like some random people picking up machetes and killing people. It was sort of organized. The army was involved, and the army coerced other people to get organized and were involved in these militias. It was organized. Okay? So he develops the hypothesis that in some sense it was the capacity of the state which facilitated the killing during the genocide. Okay? And he constructs a measure of that capacity of the state, by looking at the history of the state. So again, this is a kind of innovation. You might buy it or not buy it. But what he did was he looked at the historical construction of the state in Rwanda and basically kind of codes within the country places where the state had been kind of consolidated longer. So the state starts probably in the 1620s, and then it builds up until it's colonized at the end of the 19th century by the Germans. So state presence, sort of his hypothesis is the longer the state has been consolidated in a part of Rwanda, the more capacity it has, the more kind of control it has. And actually, I'm not going to show you the evidence, but if you look at the paper, he went and collected micro-evidence on people's attitudes towards the state and tried to show that they systematically vary with state presence. So, for example, people are more willing to kind of pay taxes to the state within Rwanda in places with greater state presence. So there's a sort of reality check on this interpretation. But here all I'm showing is, between April and July 1994, which is when the genocide was taking place, the more state presence, the greater the killing. Okay, so this on the vertical axis is a measure of like the number of people who were killed in the genocide within Rwanda, which comes from subsequent to the genocide. There was a transitional justice process, mostly a judicial process in Rwanda, using the traditional justice mechanism, which is called gacaca, and that basically people who'd taken part in the genocide had to confess, make confessions, and they were tried, and etc. And that generated information about the extent of the killing. And what you can see here is more state presence is associated with murder. But what's fascinating about this paper is if I look before the genocide, or I look after the genocide, and I look at other violence like crime, for example, I see the opposite, meaning greater state capacity is associated with less violence or less crime. But when the state is in the business of murdering people, then it's the other way around. And then after the genocide, it's less strong, but it kind of flips around. So what that says is like, this statement that state capacity is a good thing. More state capacity is better than less state capacity. That's a vertical ranking. Like, actually, it's somehow conditional on the context. That when the context is different, the consequences of state capacity are very different. So I always ask this to people in the World Bank. Nowadays, the World Bank is obsessed with like improving state capacity and building state capacity. And I always ask the question, in whose interest is that state capacity going to be used? That's the $1,001 question. But somehow that, they just have this technocratic idea that more state capacity has got to be better, right? No, I mean, you could say this is a sort of extreme example, but sometimes extreme examples make the point, But you get the idea, you get the idea. Okay, so this is, but this is not like it's always better to have a lot of state capacity, or it's always better to have little state capacity. No, it depends on the context.
Yeah.
Yes.
So after the genocide, what does that shift mean?
That there's a very different government comes in. So the government that was in charge of the genocide collapses, and a new government comes in, basically invading from Uganda, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and they create a different government that's not in the business of killing people, but actually in the business of doing what governments usually do, providing public goods and promoting development. And then the normal relationship reappears, But this is just to say, the Morris's argument that there's some kind of, reverse vertical and we got it completely wrong. Maybe, I don't know, could be true. But it seems more likely, that this idea, if this idea of I like this idea of reverse vertical because it turns out to be so provocative with the development economists, But it seems like to use the idea kind of more usefully, it's more context specific, You should, it's not like but even that is interesting. Maybe we got it wrong. Maybe assessing the determinants of one society or another society, we need to understand the context better than we do. Okay, so let me show you the actual kind of study that we did. So this is, for those of you who like AI and ChatGPT, all the details of how we did this, or rather how Jacob did it, are in the appendix. But what we wanted to do was just, so we have these classifications, right? Vertical, horizontal, manipulable, non-manipulable. So we wanted to ask, let's get ChatGPT to kind of, we scraped the whole of the Quarterly Journal of Economics, going back 100 years. That didn't work so well because development economics, it's really hard, what was development economics 100 years ago? It's actually really difficult to classify what was about what, So I'm not going to show you 100 years, that's just hard to classify. But, once you get to the 1960s, for sure, you can classify, okay, this is a paper at development economics, so we got ChatGPT to kind of just say, what kind of question are they asking here and how are they thinking about this difference between different countries? Is it like a vertical, or is it horizontal? And is it manipulable or non-manipulable? Okay, so I think, we're going to look at articles in Quarterly Journal of Economics, and we did other things, but it's just easier to scrape this going back. We also am going to show you some stuff on randomized controlled trials. Okay, so how do people doing in development economics doing randomized controlled trials, how do they think about what they're doing? Now, in that case, manipulable doesn't really apply because it's almost by definition everything. You're doing a randomized controlled trial, you're doing some randomized intervention, you kind of, by definition, you think you can manipulate it. So you can manipulate something. But here's what it is just looking from 1975. This is from the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Okay, and this is the share of articles that are non-classical. So just taking that split between classical and non-classical, classical being it's about health, it's about education, it's about the savings rate, it's about corruption, and non-classical could be, social capital. It could be like behavioral. It could be, you know, like a more there's a lot of work in behavioral economics nowadays. I didn't talk about that too much. But, you know, so what you kind of see is that there's which is like kind of like pretty obvious, I think, which is there's a rise in the share of non-classical determinants. So when people talk about development problems now, they're talking about trust, you know, or they're talking about, you know, people drinking too much in poor countries, or, you know, one of my colleagues in the Booth Business School, his dissertation was about the problem in poor countries is it's very noisy, you know, and when it's very noisy, you can't concentrate and productivity is low. So he did an experiment where he got people to make large amounts of noise outside the factory windows and showed that productivity went down. So that's making noise. Noise is a non-classical determinant. But here's the picture. So this is, I think this is pretty obvious. Like you know, maybe that's just a reality check on the kind of methodology. I mean, if that wasn't true, it would be pretty weird. But here's what is more interesting, which is just like kind of breaking this down into what is the share of articles over this period that think about these problems as vertical. I just gave you an example, like more noise is always worse than less noise, okay? And you can see actually, if anything, the share of vertical has gone up over time, okay? And moreover, the share manipulable, that might be something to do with the fact what we should do is look at this without RCTs, actually, because I'm going to, you know, that's almost manipulable with definition. We should look at this without RCTs. But what we find is like, you know, what I've been trying to suggest, you know, is actually when you're in this non-classical world, it starts getting much more difficult deciding what's vertical or not, or whose characteristics are like for me personally. And it also gets more complicated thinking how do I manipulate, you know, trust or whatever, or identity. But that hasn't stopped development economists thinking that, you know, that actually, you know, the share of things that are vertical has gone up along with the share of non-classical things, and there's an increase in the share of things which are thought of as being manipulable. So I think one of the points that we're trying to make in this paper is, you know, we as a development economists, we sort of develop these heuristics about how we think about the problems we're solving and what we're doing. And we've sort of embraced the expansion of the science and the topic, and we're interested in new things and new mechanisms and new determinants and stuff. But we've carried on with the same heuristics and applied them in a context where it's much more problematic. I guess that's one of the points we're trying to make. So this is just a way of kind of making that point more systematically. And if I was just going to look at randomized controlled trials, again, this is just using this AEA registry. You do this pre-registration, these pre-analysis plans and stuff. Again, we see what you'd expect to see, the rise of the non-classical studies over time. So people are looking at non-classical determinants. Despite that, there's very little difference between classical and non-classical in the share that view what they're doing as both vertical and manipulable. Okay, meaning, it's very clear what the ranking is. Less noise is better than more noise, and we can manipulate it. Well, we can make noise. I'm not quite sure how you reduce noise, actually. I can show causally that more noise is bad, but I don't know how I reduce noise. I'm deaf, so I don't have a problem with noise. Yes.
Noise cancelling earbuds?
Noise okay, there we are. Okay, should be subsidized by the government. That's the policy. That's the policy conclusion. Okay, so that, I guess that's the point of this, to sort of say this was our intuition, and this is a way of kind of saying it more systematically. We understand much less what we're doing in this non-classical world, okay? And there's a sort of theoretical point here which we put in the paper, which probably is like kind of completely a waste of time, but just to get it off my chest, is, in economics we tend to think of people like being in an equilibrium, Like in game theory we think, when we try to solve a game or we try to solve a strategic problem, there's a whole bunch of people and they're interacting, like what the heck is going to happen? Well, we have this idea that they're in equilibrium, okay? And our hypothesis is that they're going to come to an equilibrium, they're going to converge on equilibrium, they're going to play equilibrium strategies, and that sort of tells us, that gives us a way of saying, making a prediction about what's the consequence of this interaction. Now, in a Nash equilibrium, everyone is playing a best response. They're behaving optimally, okay? So imagine I come along, imagine if that's what the world is like. I come along and I do an intervention and I persuade you to do something different. Well, to start with, you are behaving optimally. So if I perturb what you're doing, you're almost worse off by definition. Now, it could be, of course, and I think this is this is explicit sometimes, but it's implicit in many things, which is, okay, but how do I think about poor countries? You could think that poor countries are sort of there's multiple equilibria, and some equilibria are much better in welfare terms than others, okay? Trying to solve problems of development is about kind of perturbing bad equilibria, or equilibria which are inferior in welfare terms. But of course, most of these interventions that economists are doing, they're very local. And you're not even shifting the local equilibrium. You're just shifting a couple of hundred people, There's a theoretical issue which, I'm trying to get this off my chest here. People just usually ignore me when I complain about this at a conference. But it does seem like there's an aspect of kind of under-theorization here. Like, if you're in the business of intervening and changing equilibria, under what circumstances, are you actually going to be doing enough that you could make people's lives better, Now, of course, you could say, well, people agree to take part. So, and maybe you pay money, and by revealed preference, they must be better off if they agree to take part because they couldn't take part. But, as someone who's actually done experiments, the world is more complicated than that. I've been working for 15 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then what I realized in Congo was when we started working in 2010, when we started hiring these Congolese people, and we started hiring them, to collect data, and then we start doing all these experiments with people, people basically have all these expectations. These white people showed up with money. They basically thought, this is a big problem for, bias in the results and stuff like that. There's all these experimental demand effects, and people tell you what they think you want to hear, and they tell you what they think, someone who you might hire for a job would be, what characteristics would somebody very generous, and, so there's all sorts of mechanisms here, I think. So you could take the view that, well, no, people are bound to be better off because they voluntarily take part and whatever. By revealed preference, they could say no, and that's true, you could say no. But I think there's all sorts of, in my personal experience, there's a lot of mechanisms here that, make that logic a little bit too kind of convenient. Let me give you an example of, in some sense, problems with perturbing local equilibria that you don't understand very much. So I'm going to give some examples of, how complicated this non-classical world is, okay? So this is a whole bunch of studies that the World Bank funded recently about intimate partner violence, okay? So violence within a relationship between men and women, sexual violence or other forms of violence and coercion and stuff. So I think we can safely say, at least to my knowledge, maybe, psychologists might understand something about this, but I don't think there's much good understanding in social science about the causes of inter-partner violence. There's no really convincing model to my understanding of intimate partner violence. Nevertheless, that didn't stop, people coming up with an intervention in collaboration with the government of Rwanda to reduce intimate partner violence. Okay, so what did that intervention look like? 22 weekly facilitated group discussions with an average of 19 couples per group, designed to prevent intimate partner violence by improving couples' marital communication skills, changing gender attitudes, promoting new progressive gender norms in the community. Okay, so you bring people together and you tell them, I don't know, intimate partner violence is bad, shouldn't do it. Women have rights, and they didn't have the script of the whole thing here, but there's this activity to bring people together, and they gave couples take-home exercises. All right. So what was the consequence of this? So I think there's no theory which would predict what will happen from something like this, it seems to me. So what happens? basically the consequences, intimate partner violence of all sorts basically goes up. Okay, so there's a treatment group, there's some people who are brought to these meetings, these facilitations, and there's others who aren't, and what you find is like all forms of inter-partner violence go up. So there's a sort of what they call treated, so these are the people who come, and there's what they call like spillovers, who are people who are connected to those people. The big picture here is this intervention increases intimate partner violence. Okay, it increases all sorts, sexual violence, physical and emotional. Okay, so how do they explain that? Well, their explanation is it kind of works, but it works much better for women than for men. Meaning women become empowered and men feel threatened, and men maybe come a little bit, kind of have a little bit different attitudes, but their gender attitudes are overtaken by the much larger progressive shift in their wives' attitudes. Okay? So this is just a sort of rationalization of the results. I mean, they have some survey evidence, so they can kind of tell a story, based on the impact on people's gender attitudes, so they can tell a kind of story about why this violence might have happened. But I think this is, I'm going to show you another example in a second, but like this just seems to be like a context in which, as economists, we have like no idea what we're doing. And I think there is a vertical ranking here, like less violence is better than more violence. I think that, but that doesn't mean we can manipulate it. This is like, I guess you could say it's like Vicky Foucault's, there's sort of a backlash, or there's some very kind of disturbing, unanticipated consequences. Okay, so in the paper we sort of say, like, okay, how do we kind of orient ourselves in this? Well, one way of sort of doing that is to say, is to use a distinction that Albert Hirschman, the famous development economist, introduced in the 1960s. He has a beautiful book called Development Projects Observed, when he was hired by the United Nations or the World Bank to go around the world and like explain to them why some development projects worked and others were a complete failure. The book is beautiful, it's full of ideas. And one thing he noticed was one big difference between different sorts of development projects is whether they're trait taking or trait making. So a trait making project is a project where like you have to kind of change some characteristic of society for this thing to work. And trait taking is sort of like saying, let's just take this stuff as given and work around it. All right. So here's this kind of leading example, which I like, which sounds boring, but I'll try to convince you it isn't. Which is like how to organize transportation in Nigeria. Okay. So let's say, in Nigeria you want to organize transportation. How could you do this? You could have a railway system of railways, build railways all over Nigeria, or you could use trucks, like road haulage, trucks on the road. So what's the trade-off there? Well, you're a hard-nosed economist. You could do a kind of cost-benefit analysis. How much does it cost to build the roads, and how fast do they decay when the trucks move, and how much does it cost to maintain the rail, whatever, okay? So Hirschman sort of says, no, you have to think about the choice in the context of the kind of the traits of Nigeria. And here's the traits that are relevant, okay? So tribal or group tensions and antagonism. You wouldn't use the word tribal nowadays. Nowadays you'd say ethnic, group, tensions and antagonism. So he sort of points out there are these different, especially the north of Nigeria is very different from the south of Nigeria, and there's a lot of antagonism between groups in the north of Nigeria and the south of Nigeria. The vigorous use of economic power for private ends. Widespread corruption, this is the 1960s, still true in Nigeria. Rapid Nigerianization, meaning whatever you do, you can't like put Europeans in charge of it or British people. The Nigerians are going to take it over. Okay, so the Nigerians are going to take over. You have to use Nigerians. You can't like de-Nigerianize it. Okay, and then he sort of says, okay, so here are the background traits. Let's think about how these different things work. Railways or trucking? And he sort of says, railways, okay? What's going to happen with railways? It's a national system, okay? So how do you decide, given trait 1, who's going to get a job? So you could just say, well, the best person gets the job. But it turns out, of course, that the south of Nigeria had far higher levels of educational attainment than the north of Nigeria. And the south of Nigeria is where all the missionaries went in the 19th century, and there was far more schools opened in the colonial period. So southerners had a huge advantage over northerners in getting jobs. So if you hired people based on merit, the northerners were never going to get hired, and then there was going to be a huge amount of resentment, and the railway system would like never work. It would become, you know, as he says, like, I don't know if I got the fief of one group, he says. Okay, so that won't work. You can't, okay, so what else could you do? Well, you could have kind of affirmative action, all right? So the people in the north would never get hired on merit. We'll just give them a quota, okay? But then he says, like, but these people don't get on with each other. So if you give everyone a quota, the railway's not going to work either, because no one's going to cooperate with each other. You've got this national system, and it's just going to be malfunctioning, okay? So it's not going to work. What about trucking? Trucking is great. Trucking is great because everyone has their own trucking company. Like the people in the north have trucking companies, the people in the west have trucking, and people in the east have a trucking company. The road's open. You can drive your truck from the north to the south, or the south to the north. Everyone can do that. So trucking kind of allows every ethnic group to kind of do their own thing without really cooperating with the others. You run your trucking company, they run their trucking company. We all drive on the roads. It doesn't suffer from any of these problems. Okay, so his argument is, like, whatever the cost-benefit analysis says, railways are trait-making, meaning to be successful, you've got to change one of these traits. Like, you've got to get the Nigerians to get on with each other more. But that's a big, tall order, okay? Trait-taking sort of says, well, this is how stuff is in Nigeria, so I need to design a system of transportation that, like, is compatible with that. I'm not going to change it. Maybe eventually I could change it. I'm not going to get into that. He sort of talks a little bit about, you know, could we think of something which is like trait taking in the short run, but eventually, you know, changes things. You know, so this is the logic of trait taking and trait making. Okay, and of course, a lot of the work that economists are doing is very much in this trait making mode. Like that last study I showed you, intimate partner violence, you know, we're going to intervene to, like, get rid of that trait, whatever that trait is. I mean, I'm not sure I could really describe the trait that leads to intimate partner violence, but that's obviously the idea. The idea is, if we explain to people that intimate partner violence is a bad idea, they'll stop doing it, kind of thing. Or it's wrong, or it's socially sanctioned, or I don't know, like, but they want to change the trait, okay? And that's hard to do, you know, when you don't really, I mean, at least me as a social scientist, you might want to do that, but it's hard to do it. So then the question is, given that background, can we intervene in a way that improves on that situation, okay? So let me give you another example, which I love a lot, from two of my colleagues, actually, in Chicago, Erin Kelly and Greg Lane, along with Yenhua Su and Reshmun Hussam. So here's another example of trait making in action. So female empowerment. So there's a lot of work on female empowerment and how do you intervene to kind of rebalance gender relations in a society where there's discrimination against women. And a very common idea many of us have is women's employment, giving women a job, you know. So women get a job, that does all sorts of things. You know, they have income, and maybe that improves their bargaining power within the household. Maybe it just, they get out, they create bigger social networks, they get out of the house, you know, it changes you can imagine all sorts of mechanisms that lead employment to empower women, okay? So what Erin and Greg and their collaborators did was, you know, it's a rather weird setting, in a Rohingya refugee camp in eastern Bangladesh, which Erin's mum was like running for the Canadian government. That's the connection. So, you know, but that was great. That gave them access and it gave them local collaborators. You know, what they wanted to do was, like, they did a first project where they gave employment to men, and they're actually interested in a different question, which was, like, what's the difference between, imagine I just give you money, okay? Just give you money. or I give you a job which pays the same. What would an economist say you'd prefer? Well, the money, of course, because you wouldn't have to work for it. But like as human beings, we know there's something wrong with that economic intuition, because your self-worth and your image is tied to employment, in a capitalist economist, without wanting to sound like a Marxist. Your status is associated with employment, your self-worth. I earned that money, So they just wanted to test that simple idea, like basically compare people who you gave the money to, or you gave a job paying the same amount of money. What's the consequence for those people's like mental health, for example, or self-image? And what you see is that people who you gave the job to, do way better in terms, for example, of mental health and many other things. Okay, because you're giving them something, you're giving them a sense of worth. Now, this is a question, you might think like, I haven't talked about this at all, but here's a real issue of like internal validity and external validity, meaning this experiment is done in a very kind of strange context, which is in a refugee camp in eastern Bangladesh. So you might say, what's true in a refugee camp in eastern Bangladesh wouldn't be true in downtown Taipei, say, So there's a question of, to what extent do those results kind of characterize something more broadly? I think in my opinion, the way I introduced it was meant to suggest that I think this is a kind of very general insight into kind of modern capitalist society. I'm not sure it was always true. The British aristocrats never do any work and they feel pretty good about themselves, They just go to the horse races and play polo and whatever, So it's only kind of stupid working class people who have those preferences. One of my favorite books when I was an undergraduate, I read this book called Learning to Labor, which is by a British sociologist about like how, in a class society, you have to kind of inculcate working class people with this idea that you have to work, and if you don't work, you're worthless and stuff. And this is basically how the capitalists exploit you. So anyway, the experiment doesn't have anything to say about that, needless to say. Okay, so I'm just like, that's the first paper. It's published in the American Economic Review. It's a beautiful paper, like showing you'd rather work for the money than be given it. Okay, so here's the second project. The second project is, let's give a job to women, the wife, or we give the job to man. Okay, so, and the question is, what's better for the women? All right, so the standard answer would be, give the job to a woman, that's going to empower her, it's going to increase her bargaining power within the family, that's going to be good for her self-worth and everything else. Give the job to a man, that's going to be worse for women. Now, my wife immediately got the answer to this, got the correct answer, and the correct answer is no, because if the woman gets the job and the man doesn't have a job, the guy is at home moaning and complaining, and you want to just get him out of the house. And that's basically what they find. So if you compare, there's lots of results here. There's first, and I just wanted, the top panel is treated women. That means the woman gets the job. And this is the impact on the partner. Okay, so this is, you could think of that. This is a whole kind of, there's lots of kind of touchy-feely things, of measuring lots of touchy-feely things here that I don't want to go into, like life satisfaction and stress and whatever, but psychosocial well-being. They have some index of psychosocial well-being, and they find that if the woman gets a job, it is good. It is good. Okay, her welfare goes up. We could look at there's lots of dependent variables. I'm just going to show you one thing. It is good. What about the man? Well, not much action. It's mostly negative, nothing significant. Okay, the man is at home, he's kind of complaining and whatever. Okay. Now let's look at what happens when the man gets the job. Okay, so the man, feel good about yourself. Okay, your psychosocial well-being goes up. Lots of things go up. Your sense of control over destiny goes up. Your sense of purpose goes up. Life satisfaction, it's all great. What about the woman? The woman's psychosocial well-being goes up also when the man's out of the house, okay? Because if the man, and here's the trait taking or trait making bit. This is a very patriarchal context, okay? So it's a very patriarchal society. So in a patriarchal society, the men are supposed to do everything and get the job and bring home the money and be whatever. So you could say, like, this is a sort of trait making. You're trying to disrupt the patriarchy. But the patriarchy is pretty hard to perturb, right? Go back to my point about it's a local equilibrium. It might not be a good equilibrium. There's nothing necessarily efficient about a Nash equilibrium, but it's an equilibrium, okay? Patriarchy, for whatever reason, you perturb the equilibrium, okay, it's good. The woman is better off. But here's the killer. If you look at the coefficient, the woman's psychosocial well-being actually goes up more when the man gets the job than when she herself gets the job, because she has to listen to the man sitting at home complaining and grousing. Okay? So this is almost like a Pareto improvement over giving the woman. This is probably the only existing example in world history of an empirically documented Pareto improvement. So this is like trait taking. Okay, it's a patriarchal society. Like, we'd like to change that. We don't really know how to change it, but we want to do an intervention to improve. Do we give the job to a man or give the job to a woman? And here, giving it to the man, even though like it might, it's a Pareto improvement. So this is like, I think it's a nice example of trait making, trait taking. Okay, like, you know, come back to Hirschman's point about the short run and the long run. Probably again, you know, I don't know, like, I'm getting very normative here, but personally it seems like patriarchy would be something we'd like to get rid of. And we'd like to have a kind of, not matriarchy, maybe that's like the opposite extreme, but just something with more balance between gender roles and gender, you know, ideas about women's. So it might be good to get rid of patriarchy. I don't know how to get rid of it. I mean, or they don't know how to get rid of it. And maybe in the short run, there's a short run and a long run thing here. Anyway, I'm just using this to illustrate this one particular thing, which is good. So let me go back to this example of kinship and, you know, talk about how this might also be kind of reverse vertical. As I said, you know, the kind of conventional wisdom at the moment in economics is like kinship systems are bad. You know, more elaborate kinship systems and clans and whatever, you know, are kind of associated with kind of poverty. And the evidence for that most people cite comes from a paper by Benjamin Enke in 2019 called Kinship, Cooperation, and the Evolution of Moral Systems. Moral is a big word. Moral is a big word, not a word that economists use very much. Okay, but he basically develops the idea that what he calls tight kinship systems, you know, I'll explain what that is in a second, are a feature of underdeveloped societies. Okay, so here's the map of the world. How do I know what a tight kinship system is? Well, he uses questions from something called the Ethnographic Atlas. So the Ethnographic Atlas is a database that was constructed in the 1960s and 1970s by a gentleman called George Murdoch, who was an anthropologist at Yale, and him and a team of researchers kind of tried to put together a data set of the features of different kind of ethnic groups in the world. There's about 100 different variables measuring their economic activity, their political and social organization, and things like that. Okay, so he develops a kind of variable which he calls kinship tightness, which uses different variables to that. So, for example, are there clans? Okay, so what's a clan? You know, a clan is a sort of, you could say, a fictive kinship group, you know, outside of the kind of immediate extended family. So I don't know if they have clans they certainly have clans in China historically. I don't know if you still have clans in Taiwan. In England, we don't have, you do in, okay. Like
18 ethnic groups.
So, you know, in England, if you look at like European society, there's no evidence of like clans or extended kinship groups like that, except in parts of like Scotland or Scandinavia, for example. In fact, the word clan itself comes from Scotland, from the description of Scottish society. But the Germanic tribes who kind of colonized most of Western Europe at the end of the Roman Empire didn't have extended kinship groups at all. So there's a kind of these extended kinship groups and clans never seem to have emerged in Western Europe. So the ethnographic atlas, has codes basically whether or not societies have these extended kinship groups, these clans, whether or not they have unilineal descent. So unilineal descent is just like descent through either the father, kind of patrilineal descent, or matrilineal descent. So some well-defined kind of mechanism of descent. Again, in British society, you have neither. You don't have a kind of well-articulated descent system like that. You could trace your ancestry through your father's side or your mother's side. It's sort of vague. Okay, joint residence. Whether kind of family units tend to live together, and then a variable about the importance of the kind of extended family. So he just takes the average of that and sort of says, these things are kind of categorical. Or if I take the average of that, and then I look at kind of above median or below median, so I kind of split the sample into places which have are relatively high on this index, and then places which are relatively low, like the top 50% and the lowest 50%. I can kind of plot them, and you can see red, there's a lot of groups with tight kinship groups in Africa. They're kind of all over the world, even in the Pacific. Let's see where Taiwan is. I think Taiwan is there. Yeah, like you're there. I don't know how many ethnic groups. There's probably multiple ethnic groups in Taiwan. In the ethnographic atlas, probably kind of traditional Taiwanese ethnic groups are kind of coded, but there's some variation there. And you can see it kind of spread all over the place. You get within India or Central, Asia. So then he does lots of exercises with this, which I'm not going to show you. But one thing he does is looks at the correlation between income per capita and kinship tightness. So imagine you can see, of course, this is at the level of ethnic groups. So there's multiple ethnic groups in a particular country. So what he does is he averages that across the different societies in a particular country. So you get at the country level a score for kinship, the average kinship tightness. And he shows that that's correlated, significantly correlated negatively with income per capita. Okay, so this is just looking at the national level. So according to him, and then there's a bunch of different controls here from the ethnographic atlas or otherwise. Okay, so without going into that, he tries to show there's this robust negative correlation that societies which have greater kinship tightness are poorer. That's fine. My comment on that is it's a correlation. There's many things that are different between Africa and Western Europe other than the tightness of kinship relations, okay? And to sort of problematize that, I don't have a regression, but, this is something we've been kind of trying to think about is, if you're interested in East Asian industrialization and think about Korea and think about how Korean economic development has been organized for the last 70 years, it's actually all organized by family firms, okay? So they're all organized around the family, and there's a fascinating qualitative literature. To my knowledge, there's no real kind of empirical studies by an economist on this. There's a fascinating qualitative literature about how there's a real synergy between the family, in some sense, and the way the businesses operate. Okay, so the head of the chaebol treat the employees as kind of part of some extended family, and they create these kind of fictive kinship relations. They relate to each other in a kind of kinship idiom, and they use that to kind of build trust and cooperation within the business. Okay, so that raises the question of okay, so it might be true that, I don't know anything about the causality here, but it might be true that there's some correlation here, but there could be an enormous amount of heterogeneity in the relationship between kinship tightness and economic development. And in particular, cultural contexts, such as in East Asia, maybe kinship tightness is actually extremely efficient way of organizing businesses or organizing firms. So of course, in that Korean case, there's no kind of counterfactual. If if you wanted to do research on that, you'd have to try to find some kind of variation, across Korean businesses or whatever. So this is just a kind of observation. You could argue that Korea would have grown even faster had businesses not been organized along the lines of family. Okay, so you could, but given how kind of sort of dramatic historically Korean industrialization is, or indeed Taiwanese industrialization, where most firms, as I understand it correctly, are also family-owned firms, basically. Not TSMC, I learned this morning. And I asked, why isn't Morris Chang's children running the business? And the answer I got was, well, he spent too much time in America. And he got a lot of money from the government, they said. And I said, well, that doesn't matter because Hyundai and Samsung and all of those countries or companies got tons of money from the government too. So that can't be the reason. So that's why I started with he spent too much time in Morris Chang spent too much time in America.
That's why Samsung's behind.
Well,
No, but Intel is also behind.
yeah, Intel are behind, yeah. Okay, so just to say, like, without wanting to criticize, Professor Enki's empirical work in the way I could do if I was in a different mood, it seems to me that, it seems very plausible that, these kinship, think about, kinship systems can be perfectly compatible with, there isn't some simple ranking of kinship tightness, like better, worse, that kinship tightness couldn't be good in some circumstances compared to others, okay? And, let me give another example of this from the work of Avner Greif, the kind of great economic historian Avner Greif. So Avner's work, Avner was very interested in this question of kinship and the organization of trade. He was an economic historian, so he studied the late medieval period in the Mediterranean, and in particular in his dissertation he studied these so-called Maghrebi traders. So the Maghrebi traders were Jewish merchants, most of whom lived in Egypt, and they were a very close kind of kinship kind of system linked by religion, but they traded all over the Mediterranean. Okay, and so this was the late medieval period. This was a period with a lot of political fragmentation. So there was no kind of state to enforce contracts or property rights. And so how did they manage to kind of do all this trade all over the Mediterranean? And what he showed is they used all these reputational mechanisms. So if you sailed to Barcelona, and you paid all this money and you sort of said, okay, you deliver all this fish to me, in 2 months' time, and you came back and the guy said, fish? What fish? I don't remember you mentioning anything about fish. So you were cheated. If one of these traders were cheated, then they would tell everybody in their mechanism, in their kinship group, and nobody would trade with those people in Barcelona from that point on. So they used this kind of collective punishment. So it was the strength of the kinship system that actually allowed them to enforce contracts and facilitated the kind of expansion of trade in the medieval period. So I think that's a great example of how kinship kind of worked there to actually allow trade to happen in the absence of kind of state authority. But then he makes another interesting comparison. He has several papers, so I'm just citing the one here where he makes a comparison with the Genoese. So the Genoese in the north of Italy. So the Genoese were trying to compete at the same time, but the Genoese didn't have these tight kinship relations. So actually, they couldn't use the same mechanisms to enforce contract because they couldn't coordinate their behavior, basically. So then what did they do? Well, they had to find a substitute. And what they did is they tried to develop proper legal institutions so that if somebody cheated you, you could go back to Genoa and you could take it to a court, and the court tried to start developing mechanisms of enforcing contracts through legal mechanisms. Okay? So at the time, that worked way less well than the way the Maghrebis. So it kind of worked okay, but it didn't work so well. But then the world changed, and context dependent. Okay? And in particular, trade expanded dramatically in the Eastern Mediterranean. This was connected to the expansion of the Ottomans, and the kind of Ottoman consolidation of the Ottoman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. That led to big increase in trade. Why? Because the Ottomans provided a bridge between Asia, in some sense. So a lot of trade, goods came from China, came through the Ottoman Empire. So then you could become a kind of link between the Ottoman Empire and China and Western Europe, and so suddenly there was all these trading opportunities. But for the Maghrebis, that was really difficult to take advantage of that because they were very specialized in these trading entrepôts, and you had to coordinate everybody on moving to the other end of the Mediterranean. But the Genoese, the institution that the Genoese developed was somehow much more flexible. So then he shows how the Genoese system, their mechanism, which didn't have these basically contract enforcement based on kinship, turned out to be much more flexible when the world changed. So we discussed that as, again, an example of, in some circumstances, dense kinship systems can be advantageous. They can actually do better. But in other circumstances, they're like worse. Okay? And here the mechanism is, because if you don't have them, you create these more formal institutions in his paper. So I think his paper is an example of what I'm talking about, which is, some things can be, like the ranking can reverse depending on the context. Okay? That sounds like a completely obvious and bland conclusion, But I think if you think about it in terms of the way people have thought about development, it's actually quite a radical idea, because it means you can look at any society and ask yourself the question, maybe they're good at something we're not, and maybe if the context was different, they'd actually be better equipped to succeed than we are. That's what I'd like you to get out of the paper. So you could sort of say here, I'm kind of talking about this, like the way your determinants, whether they're good or bad, depends on the context. I've been giving you these examples of the context, okay? But it could also depend on the objectives. And so this is like, your question, which is, as economists, we all tend to be completely obsessed with maximizing GDP per capita, okay? But imagine you were not obsessed. Maybe you started worrying about inequality. Something which was bad for GDP per capita might actually be really good for inequality. And let me give you an African example. So there's a literature now in development economics on the so-called kin tax. So the kin tax is like redistributive pressure. So one thing about kind of extended kinship systems is often there's a lot of pressure on people to redistribute. So if you become successful, you become wealthy, then so for example, I work a lot with a Nigerian historian, and in his village, I'm a chief in his village. I can't, I don't have the hat and stuff, but I'm a chief in his village. So when you go to his village, so he's a big man, so he's relatively wealthy. He has a job in the United States. He also teaches at the University of Nigeria. You come home in his village, within 10 minutes, there's like 20 people outside his house, basically, oh, Chima, this, we have that problem, we have this, and he has to deal with these problems. And the problems are, he has to redistribute, basically. So there's all these people who kind of have, it's interesting. It's not charity, actually, because the way the society works there, people have kind of rights over other people. Like the way I kind of interpret that, what I've observed, it's as if people actually have a right to other people's incomes. It's not like I'm giving people income because I'm so generous, or I'm so pro-social, or I'm so altruistic. No. People have claims on other people's income and wealth, And why is that? Well, because people in Africa, they don't think in this very individualistic way that English people like me think. Meaning, you think in terms of your relationships and the community. Okay? And you don't think of yourself as an isolated individual. You think of yourself as part of a kind of collectivity. So then the notion of this is my money, and, if I give you some of it, that's just because I'm a nice person, is not the right way to think about it at all, actually. It's a much more this is a much more collective resource. And so people have rights on other resources because we're all working together, and nobody does anything on their own, by the way. I might have been successful and have a PhD, but we all did that together. Everyone did it. So just to kind of give you some sense of You know, the first time I ever kind of understood this in Africa, I was working in Sierra Leone in West Africa, and I hired this chap, this local chap. I was leaving, and I hired him to collect this stuff for me in the National Archive. We're still very good friends. And then I came back 3 months later, and I like, okay, Andrew, like, whatever. So we start looking at the documents, and then it turns out that he wasn't doing it. He'd got these other people to do it, like his cousin was doing it, and the friend of the cousin, and the whatever, okay. And I was like, Andrew, I asked you to do it. And he said, I am doing it. I am doing it. I said, no, you're not doing it. Your cousin from Bo is doing it. No, I am doing it. And then I realized that he wasn't lying, but his concept of I was different from my concept of I. My concept of I was you personally are sitting in the National Archive and scanning the documents. And his concept of I was no, like the community is doing it. And so it was like a problem of translation from the Mende to the English. And that's when I realized, okay, I'm thinking about this in completely the wrong way, you know. So just to say, like, you know, economists look at work in Africa, they're like, Africa is poor, let's try to find the X factor that explains why Africa is poor, okay? So the kin tax sounds like, you know, you have to redistribute money, that undermines your incentives, that, you know, so that's bad. So, you know, so there's a whole bunch of papers on that, okay? And so, you know, one of my favorite, there's too many details here. Let me just tell you the story. The story, so Pamela Jackiella, she's a very creative economist at the University of Maryland. I think she's in Maryland. She might have moved to Michigan. But I'll tell you the following, here's the following experiment. I invite you to come do this experiment, and I can give you I give you some capital, and I give you an investment option. And one investment option has a very high return, and another investment option has a low return which can't be observed by people, okay? So then what do you do, okay? So by people meaning by other people in the room, and in one version of the experiment, by your relatives who come to the room to the experiment with you, okay? So what she shows is people are willing to give up the very high return activity in order to hide the fact that they've got this return in some sense. And in particular, they're really willing to do it in the case where, you know, so this is like 80 shillings or less. So the way it goes is you get some endowment, and the people don't know whether you get the high endowment, which is 180 shillings, or the low endowment, which is 80 shillings. So if you invest 80 shillings when you get 180 shillings, you're doing that basically to hide the fact that you got the large endowment, okay? And you're more likely to invest 80 shillings, like hiding the endowment, when this is like public, meaning it's observed, and you have relatives who came to the game with you. So this positive coefficient sort of says, like, if you show it with relatives and it's public, then you're much more likely to start pretending that you got the low endowment, okay? So you're kind of hiding money because if you win, your relatives are going to like pressure you for it. That's the story, okay? And here you're taking an inefficient, you basically take an inefficient action, okay? But imagine, but you know, in some sense you could sort of like, I tried to introduce this by already giving you the idea that this is a very partial way of thinking about this issue. You know, that this redistribution is in a whole kind of setting, and like, imagine you cared about inequality instead of just, imagine that does disincentivize effort. I'm not sure it actually does. You know, like if you go in, for example, southern Nigeria, like everywhere you go, there's huge houses. Like my friend has this huge house. Like no one's hiding anything. Like everyone knows he's wealthy compared to everybody else. He has this big house. Like everyone can see it. Like you go in any village in southern Nigeria, people have these big houses. So no, like the hiding business is a bit weird for me. But even if it were true that this redistribution was disincentivizing people, it's also redistributing stuff, you know, and it's a mechanism for redistributing and kind of equalizing. So here you could sort of say, like, if your objective is maximizing GDP, maybe this is not a good characteristic of society. But if you're really worried more about equality, so your objective is different, then the ranking could reverse, and it could be better to have this mechanism than not. So this is the idea here is like this, it's vertical or reverse vertical depending on the objective. So before I was emphasizing a lot like just depending on the context, so now I'm just saying depending on the objective also seems to matter. Okay. So here's the most radical idea, which is political institutions. So meaning back in the vertical world, democracy is good, state capacity is good, checks and balances are good. Like we have a very clear ranking, in Western social science of like political institutions, like how political institutions should be. Some political democracy is better than no democracy. Checks and balances are better than fewer checks and balances. And let me just, take you back to the 1960s. Julius Nyerere. So Julius Nyerere, he was the first prime minister and president of Tanzania, of Tanganyika and then Tanzania. He was a kind of intellectual who wrote kind of extensively about the challenges in post-colonial Africa. And one of the things he wrote about, which is very interesting, is about democracy and the appropriateness of democracy for the context. Okay, so for the African context. So this is from a famous essay of his called The One-Party State. Like he's basically trying to justify a one-party state. Now, when you think about the one-party state, you think about, the Kuomintang, and that's terrible, isn't it good we got rid of them? And yeah, could be. But so what Nyerere sort of says is, how do Africans make decisions? Well, by consensus, by deliberation, by the word that they use is like palaver, by palaver. Like like my friend's village, for example. If you go in my friend's village, they have this council. How do they make decisions? By consensus. Like nobody ever votes on anything. Like you never make a decision by voting. Like if you can't make a decision by consensus, you just come back the next day and you keep discussing. Okay? So that's what Nyerere says, and he sort of says, okay, look, but this is too clumsy a way of conducting affairs in a large modern state, right? So like that works, because historically African society was extremely decentralized, but all these Africans were put together in 50 big nation states by colonial powers. And he's talking about, okay, how do we build political institutions in this big thing called Tanzania? We're not all in the village making our own decisions anymore. Okay? But the need to organize government discussion does not imply the need to organize an opposition group as part of the system. Okay? So he sort of says, I'm not arguing that two-party system is not democratic. Of course, he's very much thinking about the British system. I'm only arguing that it is only one form that democracy happens to take in certain countries and that it's by no means essential. The institutions of a democratic government must reflect the national culture. We refuse to adopt the institutions of other countries, even where they've served those countries well, because it's our conditions that have to be served by our institutions. So he's basically also saying, like, he's making a reverse vertical, a low, context dependent. He's not saying Western democracy is bad for Western societies. He's saying, in our context, a different political institution is appropriate. And his argument, he goes on, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but because of the context, and the context is shaped both by African culture and also by the kind of colonial legacy, of like mixing all these people together in kind of one country and then saying bye-bye Tanzania. That in that context, a way to institutionalize effective kind of political decision-making is through the one-party state. Okay, so he's not like, there's a lot of discussion of like, oh my gosh, one-party state, isn't that a dictatorship? Could be. But his argument is actually this is a way of institutionalizing traditional democratic practices in Africa. Okay, and I think it's a genuine argument. So that's a context. So this is like really, like I thought I'd end with a radical argument, which is not to say that democracy, and African society is intensely democratic, but the question is, how do you institutionalize that in this alien creation of a modern post-colonial nation state? That's what he's talking about. So I think even we should think about political institutions in a kind of, there, I'm going to conclude, all right? So you got the point. The point is, the point. I've been talking about the point.
Don't.
Yes. No, you don't know what the point is?
That
No.
last point, I didn't get. That last African point.
Yes, you don't get the point?
No.
The point is like political systems can be context dependent also, meaning the legitimacy of political systems can be context dependent, They can be, so we have this idea of democracy. I think like democracy is like agriculture, democracy was invented by many human societies in different contexts all over the world, like democracy wasn't invented by the Greeks. It was kind of. Actually, not really. It was borrowed, from Syria or, the Levant. The current state of the art amongst ancient historians is that actually the Greeks borrowed democratic practices which antedate that from the Mesopotamia, basically. But it was invented and it was reinvented and readapted and whatever. And there was a democracy in ancient Mesopotamia. There was democracy at the time of the Buddha, in the Ganges plain. Like democracy is everywhere. So I think but the question is, how do you institutionalize democracy, and how do you make democratic practices work in different societies? And you could say, Nkrumah was talking about like trait taking or trait making in some sense. Like he was saying, like we have this weird thing, a nation state with all these ethnic groups that the British Empire threw together. We all have this way of making decisions at the village level, but that doesn't scale up, to a whole nation state with millions of people. So we need to find some way of like institutionalizing our traditions in this context that's going to actually work. He doesn't talk too much about where we're going, but he also tried to, there was this whole thing called Ujamaa, which was about creating Tanzanian national identity also, So maybe this is a kind of trait, you could say this is a trait-taking argument. Yeah. That might be one way of saying it. That's it, that's what you got. That's all I have.
The floor is open, so who has questions? Yeah.
I would like to know how you think about economic development is kind of culturally determined or context dependent, or whether this two notions are the same or is different. Culturally determined or context dependent.
Well, I mean, I think like culture is, just like there's a lot of issues there. You're right that I'm kind of bundling together stuff that's actually distinct. Like the Maghrebi thing is like, we have this problem, we can leverage this to solve the problem. That's different from Nyerere, who's sort of saying, this is how we do things, and we want things like the Maghrebis didn't say like, this is the appropriate way to do things because of who we are. They just said like, we can get this done by leveraging these kinship systems or whatever. And that is, I'm sort of bundling together stuff which you could disaggregate and say there's qualitatively different things going on. I think like in that, there can be some element of disincentive, from this redistribution. Like not all of it is voluntary, but there's also good things. So I guess I just wanted to say, shouldn't we think about the net effect, and we might put more emphasis on one mechanism or another, depending on our objectives. If we're really worried about income per capita, then we put a lot of emphasis on this disincentive effect, which Pamela Giacchiello's experiment kind of illustrates. But in another context, maybe we put more weight on something she doesn't even look at, which is this redistributive aspect. And the funny thing is, I actually taught that. If you teach that paper I taught that paper in like Nigeria or Kenya or whatever, all the Africans say, well, like, why is she only looking at that? Like, what about the plus side? Like, without me saying anything. Just like, if I stand up and talk about the experiment and they're like, well, okay, yeah, I get that, but what about all the positive things? That's all the Africans always say that. Like, but you're missing the net effect, So I think like, and so that's what I wanted to say. I think like the culture could be part of the context. The context could be lots of different things. It could be like in this kinship thing, it seems like that's a cultural thing. It's kind of part of the context. But the context could be other things too. It could be, historical legacy, it could be colonial legacy, or it could be the context could be also, like think about international trade theory. We're very comfortable at thinking about factor endowments and how factor endowments influence the context influences what you specialize in. And, so I think the context kind of comes up in a kind of traditional economic models. Of course, here we're interested in these kind of non-classical kind of things, because that's kind of what Nathan and I tend to think about, a lot of the time. But it could be cultural, it could be, context could mean, different things, I think, also.
Professor Robinson for the wonderful lecture, and I want to ask that Taiwan is now facing some pressure under two superpowers, which is the US and China, and we're struggling now. I want to ask this inclusive institutions still sustainably development even under the persistent threat for both political and security?
Well, my answer to that is, is that Taiwan has always been under persistent threats, forever, I tell this story this morning, which is, I was in Korea, and in Korea they say the same thing, how can Korea now, there's all these threats, and China and Americans and whatever, and I'm like, you can go in a Starbucks in Seoul, there's a bomb shelter under it. You're 40 miles from the North Koreans who are armed to the teeth waiting to invade. And it's been like that for decades, and that didn't stop anything. So this country has kind of even more challenged. This country's never had its sovereignty accepted, unlike South Korea. At least South Korea has the advantage of being part of all these international institutions and having its sovereignty recognized so I think Taiwan, nevertheless, has flourished in spite of this extremely, complicated geopolitical situation that it's been in, from the get-go, So I think, stay calm.
Such a British answer. Come on. May I? Okay. You and I will have lunch tomorrow, but
Okay.
I'm just gonna ask one burning one.
Uh-huh.
How would you explain John Lennon's song, Imagine, to this context? Now there's no institution. Now there's no religion. Now how would that context to provide that prosperity or equality or social justice?
It's a long time since I listened to that. I'm too young to remember John Lennon. I don't know. Religion. You imagine there's no religion. I think
I'm looking at your first page. You're talking about it's not possible.
What's not possible?
Not changing beliefs, not changing the caste systems. Is it difficult? Or
Oh,
is it
no,
not
it is possible. It is possible, absolutely. I'm just talking about, some things are much harder to change than other things. Societies change a lot. In fact, if you went back to the late Middle Ages in England, there were people called Baker. What did Mr. Baker do? Mr. Baker made bread. Mr. Cooper made barrels. Mr. Smith was a blacksmith. So actually, in British society, you had this occupational specialization, inherited occupational specialization, which is rather like the caste system, But that withered away in the early modern period, in some sense, So I think societies, of course, within my own lifetime, think about people's attitudes towards homosexuality, for example. It's radically changed. It's absolutely radically changed, at least, in large portions of the population. Or people's attitudes towards women have radically changed, So I think you do see cultural change. I don't think we understand too well when it happens and why it happens much more rapidly in some spheres and what triggers it. And, but I think you do see cultural change. You're just saying the caste system has been around for a long time, probably at least 3,000 years, and it's perpetuated itself for a long time. And could things happen rapidly? The great example is foot binding. So foot binding in China was around probably for 1,000 years, and then it disappears within 10 years in the 1920s. There's a famous paper by a sociologist. Within about 10 years, foot binding disappears, and people stop binding the feet of their daughters in China. That is a dramatic change for something that had been around for hundreds or maybe 1,000 years or something. So there are these famous examples of very rapid cultural change, and so that's but I don't think we have a great handle on how to do that, how to trigger that, and how to, I'm emphasizing here our uncertainty about these things and how changing these things are full of unintended consequences. And maybe that's just how it is. That's the French Revolution, was full of unintended consequences too. But you could make the argument that the French Revolution, the net effect was positive. Like revolutions, most modern democracies in Western Europe arose from conflict and violence and stuff, and so maybe just that's just inevitable. But I feel a little anxious about advocating that as a kind of research design.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so I guess we have to conclude it then here, and thank you very much for coming, and let's give Professor Robinson